the basic idea here is that the tools have agency, they do things, and they act on us and we act on them. And it's kind of a dialogue. So if I'm using it, and this is kind of borne out in the classic metaphor, like if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. The tool, and then that's kind of an exaggeration, but the tool shapes our way of knowing about things. And so when we bring that to a coding space, our tools are programming languages and frameworks. And the frameworks that you're using are informing how you come to know about programming. The tool that you're using has a lot to say about what makes a good coder, what makes a good programmer, what makes a good software program. That's borne out in a lot of the kind of products that we interact with a lot. You think about material design, or the Apple philosophy of product design, or whatever, that the tools are telling us what's important. They have a political kind of agenda that they are forwarding through their interactions with us. So taking that into an education space, what do our choices of programming language or framework say about what we think makes a good programmer? And then how does that affect who shows up in our class, who feels safe, who feels empowered, who feels disempowered in the classroom? The big thing that I do when I'm choosing tools is, one, I go for open source almost all the time. I feel like that's resonant with the mission of public education. And I run classes where students are choosing their domains that they're focusing on, and I'm not running a domain-specific class. Now, what I mean by domain is a set of skills and practices that are associated with a certain kind of product. So a domain might be game development, or mobile app development, or full stack development, or something like that. That's a domain. And it's great to be able to sign up for a class like that because you get a lot of really like targeted practice on something. But what you do when you do that is you take the creative possibility of programming as a way of knowing, and you shrink it down to programming as a means to an end. And I don't want my class to be that way. If a student opts into that path where they are learning this very narrow framework, this very narrow domain, that's great because they've opted in. But if I'm offering a programming class, I'm not going to shrink down that creative possibility to something really narrow that may or may not be enacting a political agenda that I feel like is ethical.
Yeah, I think I'd like to interject example for younger grades just to contextualize it. So like an example, Scratch as a platform and a language. An affordance of Scratch is that you can create all these media arts related things in games. It's block based, so you don't have to worry about syntax. So you don't have to have a high level of reading ability to be able to engage with it, things like that. So those are some affordances. But an example constraint is that because it's so heavily based on the visuals, it is not very conducive to people who are blind. So if you are unable to see or have difficulty with your vision, you would not be able to engage with Scratch as well as somebody who doesn't. But then on the other side, there's something like Sonic Pi, which is text-based, and you write out lines of code which create music. And so as an affordance, it really allows you to synthesize music in an interesting way using code. But as a constraint, it does not allow you to make like the media art stuff that you could do in Scratch in terms of like making a game or characters and whatnot. So whatever platform you end up choosing are going to have these affordances that allow you to do things, and then these constraints that kind of like prevent you from doing other things. So you kind of have to take those into consideration when choosing what kind of platforms that you're going to use. How do you take these different affordances and constraints of a platform, and how do you take into consideration how kids can engage with them and what they can create with them? How does it impact your decisions?
It impacts them fundamentally. I kind of have a library of stuff that I think of when kids come to me with different ideas. And we do a lot of work to help kids come up with ideas. I can't discount that. The kids don't come in, most of the time they don't come in with ideas at all. If you're super lucky, a kid will come in and know exactly what they want to get out of your class. And that's so great because you can just throw like resources and stuff at them and they just like soak it up and make things.
And get bruises.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't like it when I throw it. Yeah. Anyway, but most of my students can't do that. I can't solve that problem for them without teaching them how to come up with ideas. And so we talk about that a lot. And it's not a design thinking kind of thing. We're not trying to solve problems. We're trying to empower them to use their voice with code. And so for a kid who really connects with music and they feel most empowered to use their voice in kind of a musical context, then I'm going to use something like Sonic Pi or any of the other music coding platforms or have them make like a little sampler thing. Or I mean, there are infinite examples of ways to use sound. And so what I'm doing is I'm picking a tool that makes that path easy. Mm-hmm. Because the stuff that doesn't matter should be easy. The stuff that matters should be discovered. Choosing a language, choosing a platform can feel super high stakes, especially for kids who don't really know what their options are. So I'm not going to let them choose a tool at first. I'm going to either show them a bunch of tools and have them kind of evaluate them based on their perception of the affordances and constraints. But then a lot of times we do the ideation process out of the context of coding. And then I say, okay, so the thing that you chose makes a whole lot of sense for you to start with this. And I show them kind of the basics and then they explore.
That thought process is basically what I took to add on the languages each time I did in the class that I was with. So I mentioned in a previous podcast with Bob Irving that every year or every semester you can try and add in one more thing. So learn a new language, learn a new platform, and keep building on that if you're new to CS. So you don't have to feel like you're overwhelmed starting with like 10 programming languages at once. And for me, the guiding questions that were what language or platform should I add had to do with what are kids interested in that they feel like they cannot do in their current platforms. In other words, if using platform A and B, if they feel constrained about making music, then I need to find another platform that is more conducive to that. So like that's how I got to Sonic Pi. And then eventually some kids were like, well, I want to make apps for my device. And we had a lab full of Macs. So we worked with Xcode with Swift to make iOS programs and whatnot. So like those decisions were guided by the interests of the kids that I was working with, even though we still had to take into account the constraints of here are the devices that we have available and the operating systems we're using in this class. What can we do that's interesting?
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that not every kid is going to push up against those barriers that the tools present. I really wanted them to when I first started teaching CS because I wanted to have this kind of language agnostic classroom where everyone was doing all sorts of stuff and we were all learning, like kind of like this diverse knowledge base. I think a lot of kids end up being pretty frustrated by that. They felt like it was too open. They were like floating in a void as opposed to be floating in a vast sea of endless possibilities. That's just kind of a cheesy way to say it. They felt isolated rather than empowered by the choice. This year, I've been kind of focusing on trying to institute some creative constraint, at least at first, and kind of cultivate this willingness to push against the boundaries so that when they do get to a point where they are pushing against the tools they're using, they feel empowered to ask how to get past those constraints, and then we can switch stuff. For people who are listening to this who feel intimidated by the idea of teaching more than one like programming language, then just teach one, because there's so many things you can do, especially if you're teaching high school or older students who might get through the basics a little bit faster. You don't have to worry so much about the tool instituting a lot of constraints on you because they'll be using tools that are designed specifically to have a lot of flexibility.
That's a good point.
The tool, especially in ed tech, the tool provides a lot of scaffolding for you. So if you're using Scratch, that tool has a lot of scaffolding to make sure that you can be successful for the purpose that it is designed for. But JavaScript has some constraints. It's going to take students a really long time to get to the point where they're pushing against those constraints. Mm-hmm. But there's always going to be constraints. And when you find the end of those, then hopefully what happens is people either adapt and figure out really cool creative ways of circumnavigating those constraints, or they feel empowered to leave the nest, so to speak, and kind of strike out on their own. And I feel like I suspect, I have no reason to believe this, but I suspect that last step happens a lot out of school and not so much in school. But I didn't use the word affordances and constraints when I talked about tools. And I want to make sure before we move on, I wanted to reframe that a little bit, because tools can have affordances and constraints designed into them. But I also like the language that tools afford and constrain users. It's an active act. Because from my perspective, the tools aren't inert. They're not inanimate. They have agency. They are, I mean, for lack of a better term, they are alive, given the social context that we have situated them within.